What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the latest adaptation of The Crow. Directed by Rupert Sanders, this film stars Bill Skarsgård, FKA Twigs, Danny Huston, Laura Byrne, and more. So when I was a young kid, my mom was absolutely obsessed with the original film The Crow, starring Brandon Lee, of course the son of Bruce Lee, who unfortunately did pass away during the filming of that movie, unfortunately due to a firearm incident that ended up happening on the set. It's one of the most tragic stories in all of movie making, and if you've never looked into that, definitely recommend going back and checking it out. But as a kid, I remember my mom loving that movie, so I saw it many times. And as somebody who's been a comic book fan my entire life, especially when I was younger, I ended up learning that it was based on a comic book that started in 1989, which ended up having me seek it out. I ended up reading a few issues, maybe like a good, over a dozen issues. I'm not like a die-hard Crow fan, but I definitely, wanted to check out what the comics were like, and I thought it was pretty cool. Over the years, we've gotten a couple of other live-action movie adaptations with different actors in the lead role, none of which have necessarily ever had that success and the popularity as the first one did. And the original film is an interesting film that has a lot of style and very much came out in that perfect time where you had a lot of alt goth films that were coming out throughout the 90s, and I think The Crow absolutely capitalized on that overall tone, look, and vibe when it comes back to those 90s kind of goth alt movies. And so yeah, it has a legacy in the cinematic world, and it's one of those films that where it lacks narratively sometimes, it makes up for in style. And so going into this new one, I tried not to look at it as a remake of the original film like I think a lot of people are looking at it as, but instead looking at it as an adaptation of the comic book, because in a lot of ways this movie is drastically different from the original film and drastically different from the comics. And in a lot of ways, while it definitely has the bone structure of the Crow's narrative in some ways, it is its own thing in a lot of ways to kind of separate itself from some of the other adaptations that we've gotten thus far. But without a doubt, of course, as it is a remake of The Crow with the plain title The Crow, it is going to be compared to that original film. So when I saw that Bill Skarsgård was cast as the main character, Eric Draven, I was definitely curious. I think that he's a great actor. He's showcased himself to be a phenomenal actor in tons of films, many of which I've covered here on the channel, and usually he's one of the main things I'm praising in any of the movies that he's in. And so when that first image came out of him as the character, it was kind of jarring to say the least. They were definitely going for a more modern approach here, leaning away from that more gothic kind of cool look that the original character has, and leaning into a little bit more, again, of like a more modern approach to the character, or at least an approach that was getting labeled as a copycat of Jared Leto's Joker. Take that as you will. And so, yeah, it was already kind of getting ripped to shreds before the movie ever came out. But as I saw the trailer for the movie, I thought to myself, all right, it looks cool enough. I'm definitely interested in checking out the movie. And I was hoping for a good, solid action movie here with a vengeance story, which is exactly what The Crow is all about. And since I'm a few days late to seeing the movie in terms of, early reviews or just people going to check it out on Thursday preview screenings or even on its official day that it releases on Friday, I've already been able to see the low scores on Rotten Tomatoes, as well as some low scores that have been given by some of my peers on things like Letterboxd. And so the question today is The Crow 2024 really that bad? And I'm here to say no, but kind of. I don't necessarily feel that this movie is nearly as bad as many are making out to be. However, I don't think it's a great film either, and I'm cut right down the middle. I do think there are things about this film that are pretty cool. There are some cool action sequences throughout the course of the film. There is some pretty solid cinematography, some really cool shots in particular that I really liked. I do think Bill Skarsgård gives a pretty solid performance at the center of the film, and I think that the rest of the cast as an overall do give a pretty solid performance here. However, I do think that this film is held back by a fairly weak script, screenplay, a wildly generic villain, and overall a tone that feels very bland and been there, done that. Like I mentioned with the first film, wherever it kind of lacked narratively, I think it made up for in style. And a lot of times when you watch a movie, the style, the tone, the vibes, maybe the action sometimes can save a movie that isn't necessarily as strong when it comes down to its overall narrative. And in the case of The Crow 2024, I just think that at the end of the day, this is one of those movies that I think a lot of people are going to watch months are going to pass by and they're going to forget that they've seen it. I just got home from checking it out in theaters, and I've given myself a little bit of time to think about the movie. I drove home, I went to the grocery store to grab a couple things. I was pondering my thoughts before I sat down to write my notes to talk about this movie here with you guys. And as I was already kind of moving throughout the day, just literally like an hour and a half ago I finished the movie, I'm already starting to find myself kind of just being like, yep, that movie just kind of came and went. There wasn't much about it that felt like it ever really gripped onto my heart or my mind. And while the film does have a sense of stakes within the narrative for our main character, Eric Draven, I never found my heart connecting to those stakes, oftentimes having me just kind of watch the event of the film unfold without any personal, emotional stake in the film for me myself. The movie is watchable though. I don't think it's one of those unwatchable absolute monstrosities that comes out year to year. I think this is a movie that you can easily watch and follow, and I can see some people finding this movie to be actually pretty cool. But it's also one of those movies that is so lackluster in certain areas and so generic in other areas that I think there are going to be a lot of people who are wildly turned off from this film, or just flat out forget that they even saw this film a year or two from now. This is going to be one of those movies that I think unfortunately will kind of just be shelved in the kind of just lesser Crow sequels that we got after that original film. So for anybody who's unfamiliar though with what this movie is all about, I've already kind of given my thoughts on the movie, but let's talk about what this movie is about. The movie focuses on Eric Draven, as I mentioned, played by Bill Skarsgård, where he ends up meeting a woman named Shelly, played by FKA Twigs. The two of them end up building a romance, but her past comes back to haunt them and unfortunately leads to the death of both characters. However, he's been given the opportunity to come back as a spirit of vengeance of sorts, not that spirit of vengeance, but a spirit of vengeance of sorts, and he has the opportunity to bring his love back by killing everybody involved who killed them. And so that is the base premise of the film. I won't get too much deeper into what this movie is all about. The main villain of this film is played by Danny Huston. He plays Vincent Rogue, a man who has ties to some darkness, who is definitely, an interesting villain on paper, but ultimately is given absolutely nothing when it comes down to the script or anything to really buff him up. He's just a bad guy who does bad guy things for bad guy reasons, and unfortunately Danny Huston is one of those actors who we have seen play some pretty solid roles over the course of years, but a lot of times tends to be cast in these roles that are just throwaway, roles that are just bad guys doing bad guy things for bad guy reasons. And I think we're at a point in cinema nowadays where audiences don't want to see the bad guy who does bad guy things for bad guy reasons. We want a bad guy who has layers. We want a bad guy who we feel grows throughout the course of the film alongside our main character, even if that means they're growing more and more evil as the movie plays out, but at least allows us to understand the character's motivations. When it comes down to Eric Draven, the main star, the one you're going to spend majority of the time with here, I think Bill Skarsgård gives a pretty solid performance. In a lot of ways, the voice he's putting on in the film actually reminded me a lot of Hayden Christensen, which kind of made me think, like, what would this movie be like if Hayden Christensen had played the character of Eric Draven here? I don't know if it would have been better or worse, but I am wondering, is it just me, or did anybody else think that he actually sounded a little bit like Hayden Christensen? But for the most part, I think that Bill Skarsgård gives a pretty solid performance here, and he's the one that you can get behind. You can root for his character. You understand his motives throughout the course of the film, but I do think that, like a lot of the other characters, there isn't a whole lot of meat on the bone when it comes down to his character, and I think that's just really where this film falls flat. A film with a general premise that never ever feels like it was fully developed. And I really think a lot of the problems that this film has to do with is not the cast and not the special effects and not the choreography of the action, not the cinematography. I think it has more to do with the editing and the directorial side of this movie. The director of this film, Rupert Sanders, not to throw any shade, but I've never really been a ginormous fan of the movies he's made. I would probably say my favorite of the movies that he's made is a film I actually haven't covered here on the channel yet, but it is Ghost in the Shell, the live action version with Scarlett Johansson, which I do think is a pretty beautiful looking film in a lot of ways. I love the way that film is shot, but it's not necessarily the most exciting film to watch, nor do I think it's a great adaptation of that original anime. And then another film he did was Snow White and the Huntsman with Kristen Stewart and Chris Hemsworth. I believe that's the sequel to the first Snow White film with Kristen Stewart, which I haven't seen in many years and honestly I don't remember much about. And I would say kind of a similar thing about Ghost in the Shell, where I remember the original anime pretty well, but I don't really remember the live action adaptation. And I think that The Crow kind of falls into a similar category. The director here seems to make films that oftentimes can have cool elements in them, some pretty cool action, some big stars, some solid cinematography. It seems like the people he's working with to make these movies are fairly talented, but when it comes down to the story, when it comes down to the screenplay, when it comes down to the overall editing and the pacing of the films, they oftentimes lead to these very forgettable films that aren't all around terrible for me, but aren't necessarily something that I'm going to sing to the heavens for by the time we get to the end of the year. I don't necessarily think that this is going to be a film that's in my top 20 worst films of the year by the time we get to the end of 2024, but by no means is it going to be anywhere close to my top 20 of 2024 by the time we get to the end of the year. Again, a movie that I think falls right in the middle, that unfortunately had a lot of potential, has a really great source material that they could have played off of, but ultimately didn't do enough with. And again, similar to that first film, where it lacked narratively, it could have maybe kind of latched onto some style, and this film just lacked that style to give it that familiarity or even give it its own identity to make it something you will remember in the future. So that's going to be my thoughts on The Crow 2024. Definitely looking forward to hearing all of your guys' thoughts. Did you like this movie? Did you not like this movie? Do you think it's as bad as people are saying? Or are you kind of like me where you think it's not terrible, but it's not great either? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.